Well, Bill, thanks for being here today. We as a community have been in this conversation around questions you ask God. We're calling it Rooted. Um, how do you connect with God? How do you connect with others? How do you connect with your purpose? And this week's question is suffering. And so we have been in conversation, and part of hearing your story is I'm sitting with a man who has and is suffering, and I just appreciate your willingness to join us today and to jump in.
Well, you're welcome.
And so let's start because not everybody knows you. Who are you? Who's Bill Cole?
Well, um, my name is Bill, and um, I've been married for 33 years to my college sweetheart, Patty. We have three wonderful daughters. They're all young adults. We moved here from San Diego about 27 years ago to start our family in a more wholesome city. I've been a follower of Jesus since I was 16, and Patty and I have been members of Eastwind for the past 6 years. I was a business lawyer until I was forced to retire on disability. Unfortunately, 10 years ago, I became very ill with an extraordinarily rare disease called stiff person syndrome, or known as SPS. Carlos, when you asked me to have this conversation, my initial reaction was to say no,
Yes, it was.
because I was, and I still am, very reluctant to share my story with you for several reasons. First, because it's so personal. Second,
Yeah.
because I really feel uncomfortable talking about myself, especially publicly. And then finally, I know that I look healthy. So most people that see me, I look healthy, um, but I'm not. I'm I'm severely disabled,
Yeah.
and the fact that I look healthy, um, I feel like I'm being judged, and that's something that is really hard to accept and deal with.
Yeah. Thanks for admitting that right out the gate. One of the things that I want to ask everyone who's listening in on this conversation, because it began as an intimate conversation between two people, and I did come to you and say, "Let's take it to the world," And so, just owning that sense of vulnerability, and I trust that everyone who watches and hears this will hold it with that same gentleness, because this is a story of your life. And I think stories are one of the ways God communicates who He is to us. And very rarely are they finished or tied off or complete. They're stories of people's lives. So let's start with yours. You mentioned that you've been wrestling and suffering with this disability for some time, but tell us about your life before that, the experience of your life before your illness.
Well, like I said, I became ill about 10 years ago. But before that, in all honesty, I just can't imagine our life being any better. It was amazing in almost every aspect. There were even times that Patty and I would say we're just too blessed.
Yeah.
And just about every aspect of our life, we were happy and content. I was comfortable with my spiritual life. I was a senior partner at a large and prestigious law firm and had a very successful career that I was both proud of and had a passion about,
Yeah.
which is something that most lawyers really can't say. My entire life before I became ill was really physically focused. Um, and it was that physicality that brought me a lot of joy. As just a few examples, um, I was successful athletically. I was a high school state champion and a collegiate wrestler. I was a avid mountain biker. I was a gym rat, an amateur bodybuilder, and then I was a just a crazy chucker hunting addict. I loved the outdoors. I loved being physical, and almost every hobby and activity that me and my family had was
Yeah.
physical. 10 years ago, this disease hit me like a lightning bolt, and for several years, I I spent lots and lots of time and effort seeing many different doctors in Boise, trying to find a diagnosis. And because this disease is so extraordinarily rare, I was just not successful. And fortunately, though, with the grace of God and perhaps even a miracle, which I would love to
Yeah.
to tell you about, but I know that we just don't have the time. I was referred to the Cleveland Clinic, and I received a diagnosis of stiff person syndrome, or SBS.
SBS.
SBS is extremely rare. It purportedly occurs in only 1 out of every 1 million people. So theoretically, there are approximately 350 people, including myself, with this awful disease. The disease is progressive, it's incurable, it's autoimmune in nature, it's usually disabling, and it's often fatal. And unfortunately, the options to manage SBS are limited, and they're just not very effective for most people. The way that the disease works is interesting and pretty unique. My own immune system attacks this mechanism in my brain that controls my neuromuscular system. So as a result of that attack and the damage from that attack, my muscles are contracting approximately 20 hours a day. And the only time they're not contracting is when I'm in rapid eye movement sleep at night. So the result of having your muscles contracting all the time is I have incredible stiffness, hence the name, and pain. And I have pain even when I'm sedentary. I'm constantly in pain. But what really makes the illness disabling is that because my muscles are so fatigued from the constant contraction, when I need to use my muscles voluntarily, I have extreme muscle pain. I mean, on a 10 scale, it can be an 8 or a 9. I also will have extreme and long-lasting muscle spasms. Sometimes I've had muscle spasms that have affected every single muscle above my belt buckle, and they last a long time, and they're extremely painful.
Yeah. So, Bill, thank you for giving us a picture into stiff person syndrome. And one of the things in our conversation that you mentioned that made even sharing today difficult was this idea that it's an invisible illness. And that was an idea I hadn't heard before. Others may be familiar with it, but can you bring us into what that means to you, what that means when you say that?
Of course. As I mentioned, one of the reasons that I was so reluctant to share is that I worry about being judged because I look normal. I look healthy, and I even look physically fit, except for those people that knew me 10 years ago before I became ill. I just simply don't appear to be ill. However, my appearance is very deceiving. The reality is that I'm severely disabled. And in many worldly ways, I really feel that I'm just a shell of my former self. Most of the symptoms of my disease, especially the chronic and severe pain, they're not visible to others. That is why SBS, like many other illnesses, are referred to as invisible illnesses. Although I was reluctant to share today, the main reason that I chose to do so is because I know that everyone is going to suffer with something that's invisible sometimes during their life. And it's my hope that by sharing today, I can give people some hope and some encouragement.
Yeah.
Invisible suffering for people that don't have the illness that I have can take many forms. It can be loss of loved ones, addiction, issues with relationships, financial distress, and lots of other hardships. And it's really my hope that by sharing today, that I may be able to help others that are suffering, whether they're suffering visibly or invisibly.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Oh.
It's a helpful thing to hold in our conversation, the idea of this invisible illness. and the suffering that comes from it. And so, um, I ask this with some hesitation because it's your story, and there's such a deeply personal part to it. But would you tell us about how you've been impacted by suffering because of this invisible illness?
I can, um, and I hope I can maintain my composure. But
Yeah.
um, really, it can be summarized in two key words, which is um, extreme loss. Um, and I think I may have mentioned that before. But this disease has affected me in every way, um, physically, professionally, mentally, and emotionally. Physically, I'm in constant pain all the time and often in very severe pain. And second, living in pain has dramatically impacted what I'm able to do in my life. It's prevented me from doing all of the active things that used to bring me joy. And it's also affected the mundane and basic things in my life,
Yeah.
things such as standing or sitting, or holding an object. Um, and it's really been a challenge physically. As far as well, and just to give you a perspective, I went from a very full, active, successful life, and I now have a life that is almost completely sedentary. After I became ill, I lost 35 pounds of lean muscle mass, and now I spend the vast majority of every single day laying on my back on a heating blanket. Now, a big day for me is going on a walk, taking a shower, and shaving, and then maybe going on a single outing during the day, such as a date with Patty or going to our small group meeting.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, having a big day like that is rare, because when I do have a big day, it causes a flare up of my symptoms that lasts several days.
Mm-hmm.
So it really has impacted the quality of my life with what I'm able to do. It's also affected me professionally. After striving for many years, um, I became a very successful attorney in my career, and I had an even brighter future. Unfortunately, my symptoms became so bad that eventually I had to retire on disability
Mm-hmm.
15 years earlier than I wanted to. And then I had to retire from a job that I absolutely loved. I love my firm, I love my partners, and I love my clients. The illness has also affected me mentally. One of the medications that I'm on has caused very severe short-term memory loss,
Yeah.
which is not only frustrating, but it's embarrassing. Um, Oftentimes in conversations with people, I forget what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so, um, to be completely candid, um, you'll see me referring to my notes
Yeah.
quite often, and it's because of the issues that I have with my short-term memory. Typically I would have prepared and been able to give this presentation without any notes,
Yeah.
but unfortunately that's just not the case. And so um, that's been the biggest impact mentally.
Yeah.
Emotionally, it really has been as hard as the physical aspects. The most significant emotional impact I have is that I feel that I have lost most of my worldly identity that I had when I was healthy, which for me was a physically active, independent, successful person. This loss of identity is still very, very difficult for me to accept. Because of my physical limitations of this illness, I've also lost much of my independence. I'm now dependent on other people for very basic and mundane tasks, which frankly is really hard on my ego.
Yeah.
Things that I used to take for granted. Um, home repair projects, pulling weeds, helping with the dishes. They're just not no longer an option for me,
Yeah.
and that's just really hard on my ego from where I was prior to becoming ill, because I was so independent. The other main impact emotionally is that I've become very sedentary and isolated. And because of that isolation, I've often been extremely sad and lonely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those are emotions that I'm just not used to. I'm becoming used to them
Mm-hmm.
over the past 10 years, but there's still something that's difficult to deal with. Also, many of my relationships have been impacted from this illness. I've lost many friends, and the quality of my relationships with many people have suffered. And and the main reason for that isn't that people don't love me or don't care about me. It's just that I'm now secluded in my house, and most of my friends were related to the hobbies and activities that I was involved in, whether it's work,
Yeah.
hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, mountain biking, and becoming isolated. I've lost much of that contact. And finally, the biggest emotional impact that I've had is the effect that my illness has had in my family. I have profound sadness and guilt about the impact that it has had. The disease has taken a toll on our marriage and has affected the mental well-being of my daughters. It's very, very difficult for both Patty and my daughters to have someone in their life that's chronically ill. And it was especially hard for my girls because I became ill at a very important time in their life, from junior high through young adulthood. And, and I just have a lot of guilt and sadness about that because it really has negatively impacted their lives.
So you just kind of walked us through a road of suffering, and I just want to say thank you. And I just, as a man sitting across from you, I also want to say I'm sorry. I mean that. Um, and when you first told me your story, and you didn't go into all the different areas that you suffer, but a question I had as I listened to you, because we are together at church and we share a common community, and I just said, Bill, with all that suffering, why didn't you walk away from God? And so, you know, this question's coming. We've talked about it, but I want to raise it for you again. So many people see suffering as a reason to not believe. And so, why didn't you walk away from your faith?
My faith was strong. And once I received my diagnosis and really learned that it was something that I had to accept, I realized that my faith was the one thing that I could control. It was something that my disease couldn't. And my faith was something that my disease could not take away from me. So really, I've never struggled with my faith. And I've also haven't been angry with God. Um, and there's some aspects of my story that in a way, um, through this suffering, it's been a blessing. This is going to sound very cliche.
Okay.
I've heard people talk about a calling, having a calling from God. And when I was healthy, I had never experienced anything close to that. I had felt the Holy Spirit, but I had never felt called to do anything. But after I became ill and and was diagnosed and realized what the prognosis was, I did feel a calling. I felt a very, very strong calling from God to help and serve others. And it's almost indescribable. I could feel it really in every fiber of my being. It was just powerful. And I've tried to answer that calling in several different ways. Over the past 8 years, I have helped and served others with SPS. I have provided hundreds of thousands of dollars of free legal services with others, to others with SPS. Some of the ways that I've helped these people is I've educated them, and often their doctors, because this disease is so rare. It's also very poorly understood. And one of the things that I did once I received my diagnosis is I read everything ever published about the disease. So most neurologists and rheumatologists know nothing about this disease because it's so rare. A typical rare disease is it's classified as 1 in 4,000. This is 1 in a million. Most neurologists will never see a single person with a case of SPS in their life. So I was able to help by educating others. I didn't just help people with SPS. As part of this calling, I felt that it was important to help people in my community. And so prior to COVID, I spent several days a week volunteering time at Taft, which is a elementary school here in Boise with one of the most economically and socially disadvantaged student populations in town. I was a mentor to a young boy of a single mother that had a lot of issues. And I was also involved in the reading lab as a reading tutor. Mm-hmm. And both of those are activities that I had to do in my wheelchair because I just can't sit. But the calling that I had to help others, made it worthwhile for me. And actually, Carlos, even sharing today, really the only reason that I could step out of my comfort zone and share is because I hope that I'll, in some way, that I can give some type of inspiration or hope to somebody else.
Yeah. So often people struggle understanding who God is because it's like an idea. But what I love about what you shared today is you show us that the story of God it's just imprinted on our lives. And it includes great victory, successful career, a life you love, but it also includes great suffering and finding purpose. I think it's a worthwhile invitation. What word or encouragement of hope would you give to someone who right now just feels burdened and under the weight of suffering?
Although I've lost hope that I'm ever going to be healed of this illness, or that any more effective treatment options are going to be developed, at least during my lifetime, I have taken great comfort and peace from my relationship with God for two main reasons. First, when God did call me to serve, He really gave me a wonderful gift. And it's been a wonderful gift of having a new and even better purpose in life. Serving and helping others and having the time to serve and help others has brought me more joy than any of the worldly things, or most of the worldly things that I've experienced in my life. And even more importantly, the Word of God and my acceptance of Jesus has given me a great sense of peace to know that eventually I will be with God for eternity, and I will be with Him without any suffering and with any pain. And that gives me hope. And I know that our time on earth is fleeting, and eternity is a lot longer than our time on earth. Yeah. So I'm encouraged that I am a follower of Christ, and that I will be with God, and that my suffering will eventually end.
Yeah. Thanks for that word of encouragement. There's a phrase, the worst thing is not the last thing, it's the next to last thing. And then an invitation to the last thing is the return of all the good things. It's that returning to Christ. And that phrase always, I cling to it because there's a lot of worse things in this life. Well, Bill, thank you. You're a brave man. I so appreciate the time and effort you put into today and the vulnerability you've modeled for us and helping us have our conversation on suffering.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I have to be honest, it wasn't easy, but I hope that I've helped other people.